The car's headlights pierced the darkness of the endless highway as Emma gripped the steering wheel. The engine hummed steadily, a comforting sound in the otherwise silent landscape. In the passenger seat, her best friend, Casey, scrolled through her phone with a faint frown. The back seat was occupied by Jared and Tony, laughing quietly over a shared joke, their voices barely audible over the soft rock playlist. The plan had been simple, a weekend road trip to shake off the stress of their final college semester. The route had been carefully mapped out, but an unexpected detour due to road construction had left them in unfamiliar territory. "Anything yet?" Emma asked Casey, who was supposed to be searching for nearby motels. "Hold on," Casey muttered, squinting at her screen. "Looks like there's a place about 10 miles ahead. The Blue Iris Motel. 5-star reviews, but the photos make it look old." "Old is fine," Emma replied. "I just need a bed and a shower." The others voiced their agreement. It was late, and fatigue had long since settled into their bones. 10 minutes later, the Blue Iris Motel emerged from the shadows like a mirage, its glowing neon sign flickering faintly. The building was 2 stories tall, with weathered blue paint peeling off the walls. A lone gas station stood adjacent, its pumps rusted and unused. The surrounding area was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind. "This place looks charming," Tony said sarcastically as they parked. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, with mismatched furniture and a musty smell that hinted at decades of neglect. A bell sat on the counter, and after Emma rang it, an elderly man shuffled out from a back room. "Welcome to the Blue Iris," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Rooms are $20 a night." $20. Jared whispered. "That's suspiciously cheap." Emma ignored him and signed them in, paying cash. They received 2 keys and instructions to rooms 6 and 7, upstairs at the end of the hall. The group climbed the creaky staircase, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty building. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew, and the wallpaper was faded and curling at the edges. "This place is straight out of a horror movie," Casey joked nervously. Their rooms were adjacent, each containing 2 twin beds with worn comforters. Tony and Jared claimed room 6, while Emma and Casey settled into room 7. As Emma unpacked her overnight bag, Casey opened the bathroom door and froze. Emma." Emma looked up to see her friend standing rigidly, her face pale. "What's wrong?" Casey pointed silently into the bathroom. Emma walked over and peered inside. The mirror above the sink was cracked, and scrawled across it in what looked like smeared lipstick were the words, "Don't stay here." The atmosphere grew heavier after that. Jared and Tony dismissed the message as a prank, but Emma and Casey couldn't shake their unease. Later that night, Emma lay awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Casey's breathing was steady beside her, but Emma's thoughts raced. A faint creak broke the silence, and her eyes snapped to the door. She waited, holding her breath. Another creak. This time, it sounded closer. She slid out of bed, her heart pounding, and quietly approached the door. When she opened it, the hallway was empty, bathed in dim light from a flickering bulb. "Hello," she whispered, but only silence greeted her. Then she noticed something on the floor. A single shoe. Tony's shoe. Emma banged on the door of room 6 until Jared groggily opened it. "Tony's gone," Emma blurted, holding up the shoe. Jared's face twisted in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "He's right." He turned to point, but the bed was empty. "Tony!" Jared called out, stepping into the room. Casey appeared beside Emma, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" Before anyone could answer, a blood-curdling scream echoed from somewhere in the motel. The 3 of them bolted down the hallway, following the sound. It led them to a door at the far end, one Emma swore hadn't been there before. Jared tried the knob, but it was locked. "Tony! Are you in there?" The scream came again, louder this time, filled with sheer terror. Casey backed away, shaking her head. "This isn't right. None of this is right." Emma found a fire extinguisher on the wall and used it to smash the door open. Inside, they found a small, windowless room with peeling wallpaper and a single chair in the center. The room was empty. No Tony. Only a message scratched into the wall. "You should have left." Jared backed away, his face pale. What the hell is this place? Emma's breathing was ragged as she turned in circles, trying to make sense of the room. Casey stood frozen, staring at the writing on the wall. "We need to go," Casey said, her voice trembling. "Now." As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. The light flickered and then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. "Emma." Casey's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here," Emma replied, fumbling for her phone flashlight. She switched it on, the small beam cutting through the darkness, but what it revealed sent a jolt of terror through her. The writing on the wall was gone. In its place was a new message, scratched deep into the plaster. "Too late." Then the chair in the center of the room began to move. Slowly, it scraped across the floor, the sound piercing the silence. The three huddled together, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. "What's doing that?" Jared whispered, his voice breaking. The chair stopped. And then, from the darkness beyond the edges of the flashlight, came the sound of footsteps. Soft at first, then louder. Closer. Casey screamed as a figure lunged into the beam of light, a faceless silhouette, featureless but human-shaped, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. It moved in jerky, spasmodic motions, as though it wasn't used to walking. Emma grabbed Jared and Casey and pulled them toward the door. She twisted the knob desperately, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me," she screamed, and Jared joined her, throwing his weight against the door. The figure drew closer, its movements erratic. Emma swung the fire extinguisher blindly, the heavy metal making contact with a sickening thud. The figure stumbled back but didn't fall. Instead, it straightened, its head snapping back into place with a grotesque crack. Finally, the door gave way, and the three of them spilled out into the hallway. They didn't stop running, sprinting past their rooms and down the stairs toward the lobby. But the lobby was different. The furniture was gone, and the walls were covered in the same writing they'd seen upstairs. "You should have left." Jared pulled open the front door, but instead of the parking lot, they were met with another hallway, longer, darker, and lined with more doors. "This isn't real," Casey whimpered. "Just keep moving," Emma shouted, dragging her along. They ran down the endless hallway, the air growing colder with every step. Behind them, the sound of footsteps returned, multiplied now, echoing from all directions. One by one, the doors began to open. From each door emerged figures, faceless like the first, their movements stiff and unnatural. They filled the hallway, their numbers growing, cutting off any path back. The group skidded to a halt, trapped. "What do we do?" Jared shouted. Emma scanned their surroundings frantically. At the far end of the hallway, she saw a door marked, "Exit," glowing faintly red. "There," she screamed, pointing. They sprinted toward it, dodging the advancing figures. One reached for Casey, its cold, claw-like hand grazing her arm, but Emma yanked her free. They reached the door, and Jared threw it open. Bright light flooded their vision as they stumbled through. Emma blinked against the sunlight. They were outside, standing in the parking lot. The Blue Iris Motel loomed behind them, silent and unassuming. Casey collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. Jared leaned against the car, his hand shaking uncontrollably. "Is it over?" Casey whispered. Emma didn't answer. She turned to look back at the motel, her heart still pounding. The neon sign flickered, and for a brief moment, the words changed. "See you soon." Emma froze, her breath hitching. "Get in the car," she said finally. "Now." They didn't argue. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, leaving the Blue Iris Motel behind. But as they drove, Emma caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. For just a second, her face wasn't her own. The car sped down the highway, the tires humming against the asphalt as the sun dipped below the horizon. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with silence. No one spoke, the weight of what had happened at the Blue Iris Motel pressed down on them like a suffocating shroud. Emma gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Jared sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly ahead, while Casey was curled up in the back, trembling. Every now and then, she glanced out the window as if expecting to see something, or someone, following them. "We're not stopping until we hit the next town," Emma said firmly, breaking the silence. We'll find a hotel, call the police, and figure this out. Jared nodded mutely. Do you think, Casey began, her voice barely audible. Do you think Tony is gone? Emma's chest tightened. She didn't know how to answer. The memory of Tony's shoe lying in the hallway haunted her, and the thought of the faceless figures made her stomach churn. Let's just focus on getting to safety, Emma said, trying to keep her voice steady. The next town was a small, sleepy place nestled in a valley. The streets were lined with quaint shops, their windows dark at this late hour. They found a motel, clean, modern, and worlds away from the decrepit Blue Iris. Inside their room, the three of them sat in uneasy silence. Jared switched on the TV, letting the low hum of a talk show fill the air, while Casey clutched a blanket around her shoulders, her eyes darting nervously. I'm calling the cops, Emma said, pulling out her phone. She dialed and waited, her heart pounding. After a few rings, a calm voice answered. Local police department. How can I assist you? Emma explained everything, the detour, the Blue Iris Motel, Tony's disappearance, and the bizarre events they had encountered. The officer was quiet for a moment before replying. Miss, are you sure about the name of the motel? Yes, Emma said firmly. The Blue Iris Motel. It's off the highway, near. There's no motel by that name in our records, the officer interrupted. Are you certain you didn't misread the sign? Emma's blood ran cold. I'm not mistaken, she insisted. We were there. Another pause. Then the officer's tone grew cautious. Miss, you said your friend disappeared. Are you able to come to the station and file a report? Emma agreed and hung up, her hands shaking. What did they say? Jared asked. Emma hesitated. They don't have any record of the motel. Casey's eyes widened. What do you mean? We were just there. I know, Emma replied. But something's not right. At the police station, the officer listened patiently as Emma recounted their experience in detail. Jared and Casey chimed in, their voices laced with fear and exhaustion. When they were done, the officer leaned back in his chair, frowning. I'm not saying I don't believe you, he said carefully. But we've had no reports of a motel in that area for years. That property burned down decades ago. It was never rebuilt. Emma's heart dropped. Burned down. When? 1987, the officer said. It was called the Blue Iris Motel back then. A fire destroyed the entire building. There were casualties, guests and staff. Some say the owner was involved in something strange. What do you mean, strange? Jared asked. There were rumors, the officer continued. People said the place was cursed. Guests would report hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there. Some even claimed to see figures without faces. Casey gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The officer leaned forward, his expression serious. I'll send someone out to check the area, but if what you're saying is true, you're lucky to be alive. That night, back at the motel, Emma couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, the officer's words echoing in her mind. The fire. The rumors. The faceless figures. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. She picked it up and saw a notification. Photo saved to gallery. Her heart sank. She hadn't taken any photos recently. With trembling hands, she opened the gallery. The latest photo was dark and blurry, but as she stared at it, the image became clear. It was the hallway of the Blue Iris Motel. And standing in the center, staring directly at the camera, was Tony. But his face was gone. Emma dropped the phone, her breath coming in short gasps. From the shadows of the room, a faint voice whispered. Welcome back. Emma froze, her mind racing. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that pressed against her chest. She turned her head slowly toward the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to deepen unnaturally. Who's there? She whispered, her voice trembling. Jared and Casey stirred at the sound, sitting up groggily. What's going on? Jared asked, rubbing his eyes. Emma couldn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the corner, where a figure began to take shape. The darkness moved like liquid, congealing into a tall, indistinct silhouette. It didn't have a face, but its presence was suffocating. Casey screamed, snapping Jared fully awake. "What the hell is that?" he shouted, scrambling out of bed. The figure stepped forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, as if it were gliding rather than walking. Emma instinctively grabbed her phone and held it up, as though the device could protect her. "Leave us alone," she shouted, her voice breaking. The figure stopped at the edge of the shadows, tilting its head as if studying them. Then, in a voice that sounded like a twisted echo of Tony's, it said, "You shouldn't have left." Emma's grip on her phone tightened, and she backed toward the door. "We're leaving. We're not staying here another second." Jared grabbed Casey's hand, and the three of them bolted out of the motel room, slamming the door behind them. They sprinted to the car, Emma fumbling with the keys in her panic. She finally managed to unlock the doors, and they all piled in. "Go, go, go!" Casey yelled, her voice shaking with terror. Emma started the car, flooring the gas pedal as they sped out of the parking lot. The rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was chasing them. They drove for hours without stopping, the tension in the car palpable. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke the horizon, Emma pulled into a rest stop. She parked the car and slumped over the steering wheel, her breath ragged. "We can't keep running like this," Jared said, his voice weary. "We need to figure out what's happening." Casey nodded, though her face was pale. "But what do we do?" "That thing followed us. It knew Tony." Emma sat up, her resolve hardening. "We go back. To the Blue Iris." Both Jared and Casey stared at her in disbelief. "Are you insane?" Jared asked. "You saw what happened. That place it's not normal." "I know," Emma said. "But it's the only way. We can't keep running. We need answers." When they returned to the site of the Blue Iris Motel, the morning sun illuminated an empty lot. The building was gone, replaced by charred earth and overgrown weeds. It was as if the motel had never existed. "This is impossible," Jared whispered. Casey clung to Emma's arm, her eyes darting around the clearing. "It was here. We stayed here." Emma knelt by the ground, brushing away debris. Her fingers grazed something cold and metallic. She pulled it up, a key, tarnished and rusted, with a tag that read Room 7. "Proof," Emma said, holding it up. This was real. As they stood there, a low hum filled the air. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. From the forest surrounding the lot, shadows stretched unnaturally long, creeping toward them. "We need to leave," Jared said, backing away. But before they could move, the shadows merged into a single, towering figure. It stood at the center of the lot, its form shifting and writhing. The hollow void where its face should have been seemed to pull the light from the air. "You can't leave," the figure intoned, its voice reverberating in their chests. Emma gripped the key tightly, her mind racing. "Why? What do you want from us?" The figure leaned forward, its faceless head inches from her. "To remember." With that, the ground beneath them crumbled, and they fell into darkness. When Emma opened her eyes, she was back in the car, parked outside a diner. The sun was shining, and Jared and Casey were asleep in their seats. Everything seemed normal, but when she looked down, the key to Room 7 was still in her hand. The events of the Blue Iris Motel were burned into her memory. She didn't know if it had been a nightmare, an alternate reality, or something else entirely. But one thing was certain. Some doors should never be opened. The silence following the chaos was suffocating. Haley's breath came in sharp gasps as she clutched the rusty motel key in her trembling hand. The key was cold, almost unnaturally so, as if it had absorbed the deathly chill of the room where she had discovered its previous owner's fate. "I can't do this," she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. "I need to leave." The sound of distant footsteps sent a spike of adrenaline through her veins. She shoved the key into her pocket and ducked into the shadows of the corridor. The faint glow of the neon motel sign outside pulsed like a dying heartbeat, casting an eerie red light that danced across the cracked walls. A figure emerged at the end of the hallway. Its silhouette was unmistakably human but wrong in every other sense. The movements were too smooth, too fluid, as though the joints weren't bound by bone and ligament. Haley's heart raced. She pressed herself against the wall, hoping the shadows would swallow her whole. "Haley," the voice was soft, a raspy whisper, but it filled the space like a roar. It knew her name. She fought back tears, her mind racing through an escape plan. Then she saw it, a door slightly ajar just a few feet away. It was room 206, the same number that had been scrawled in the margin of the register she'd found earlier. Against her better judgment, she darted inside. The room was dimly lit, with only a flickering fluorescent bulb swaying above a table cluttered with papers. Her eyes scanned the room, noting the signs of a struggle, a chair overturned, a shattered lamp on the floor, and claw-like scratches gouged into the walls. On the table lay a series of Polaroid photos. Each one was faded, the images warped and smeared, but they unmistakably depicted the guests who had checked into the motel in the past, every single one of them, including Haley. The last photo was still developing, its chemical hues slowly bringing her terrified face into focus. "This isn't happening," she muttered, backing away from the table. The bulb above flickered violently, casting the room in brief bursts of shadow and light. In the corner, something moved. "Haley," the voice again, louder this time, closer. She turned, and for the first time, she saw it. The creature was no longer trying to hide its form. It was a grotesque amalgamation of features stolen from the faces of others, sunken eyes, jagged teeth, and patches of skin that didn't match. It was as if it had constructed itself out of the remains of its victims. Haley screamed and lunged for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The creature loomed over her, its patchwork face splitting into a grotesque grin. "You came to stay," it said, its voice a cacophony of overlapping tones, as though it spoke with the voices of every soul it had consumed. "And now, you never leave." Haley grabbed the nearest object, a shard of the broken lamp, and thrust it forward with all her strength. The creature recoiled, letting out a guttural roar, and she seized the opportunity to dive for the window. With a desperate push, she shattered the glass and tumbled onto the ground outside. She hit the pavement hard, shards of glass slicing into her arms, but she didn't stop. Scrambling to her feet, she sprinted toward the highway, her breath ragged and her vision blurred with tears. Behind her, the motel seemed to warp and shift, the neon sign flickering violently before going dark. Haley didn't stop running until she reached the gas station she had passed earlier. The attendant looked up from his magazine, startled by her disheveled appearance. "Help me," she gasped, clutching the counter for support. The attendant stared at her, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words were drowned out by the faint sound of static emanating from the small TV mounted on the wall. Haley turned to look, her blood running cold. The screen showed a grainy image of the motel. The neon sign was back on, glowing ominously in the dark. And there, standing in the parking lot, was her own figure, staring back at her. "No," she whispered, backing away. "No, that's not me. I'm here." The attendant didn't respond. The world around her began to twist and distort. The gas station lights flickered, and the walls seemed to close in. Haley turned, but the exit was gone. The air grew heavy, suffocating her. And then she heard it again, soft and mocking, as if it came from inside her own mind. "Welcome back, Haley." The motel had claimed her, its curse eternal.